Picture this. Wedding bells thunder through a cavernous cathedral, their echoes rolling like thunder trapped in stone. Incense chokes the air, candles drip hot wax onto flagstones, and the jeweled crown pressed to your skull feels less like honor than a shackle. Beneath layers of gold brocade heavy enough to crush a child, your breath comes shallow, ribs aching against the fabric. You are 14, yet they call you bride, queen, consort. Across the aisle stands your groom, pale-skinned, avoiding your eyes, lips set in a grim line. He is your uncle, your king, your captor. The crowd erupts in applause, mistaking your silence for majesty, your trembling for grace. This is no fairy tale. It is the machinery of empire grinding flesh into treaties. And you, Anna of Austria, are the sacrifice laid upon its altar. Anna of Austria was born not into childhood, but into obligation. The daughter of Philip Roman III of Spain, she grew up within the sun-drenched courtyards of Valencia and Madrid, where orange blossoms scented the air and peacocks strutted along marble paths. Yet even those bright gardens could not protect her from loss. When her mother, Queen Margaret, died in childbirth, Anna was barely 10. With grief still heavy in the halls of the Alcazar, she was pressed into responsibilities too large for her small frame. Supervising younger siblings, leading household prayers, learning the posture of a queen long before she had grown into her own bones. Europe, meanwhile, smoldered like dry timber. The great houses of Habsburg Spain and Bourbon France glared at one another across borders sharpened by centuries of war. Armies clashed, treaties fractured, and monarchs sought any advantage to secure their thrones. The solution was as ancient as it was brutal: bind enemies together with a girl's body. Thus Anna, a child still tracing rosaries with trembling fingers, was chosen to be offered to France as a living treaty. Her dowry was immense, 500,000 crowns, wealth enough to feed an army. Her womb was counted before her heart had learned what love meant. Failure to produce heirs would mean not simply shame, but perhaps the collapse of fragile peace. Her journey northward was less a procession than an exile. 40 days of bone-shaking carriage rides through autumn rains turned her skin pale and her stomach weak. The food grew stranger as the miles passed, stews thick with foreign herbs, breads too coarse for her Spanish taste. Each border crossing stripped away more of her world. At the river by Dasoa, the ceremonial exchange took place. Her Spanish attendants, the women who had sung her lullabies and whispered comfort since childhood, were dismissed. In their place came strangers who spoke quick, cold French. By the time Anna reached Bordeaux, her isolation had already begun. The court saw only a bride bedecked in gold, a promise of alliance. She alone felt the grief pressing into her chest, the knowledge that her Spanish name, her mother's tongue, her very self would be sacrificed upon the altar of diplomacy. The crowd cheered for peace, but Anna knew what had been bartered away: her childhood, her freedom, her home. The wedding night was less a union than a trial. The archbishop blessed the royal bed as though it were an altar, and courtiers filled the chamber, whispering, scribbling notes, watching. First came the examination. Anna's body was stripped bare beneath the stares of physicians, matrons, and secretaries who treated her not as a bride but as livestock. They recorded her hips as adequate for childbearing, her hymen intact, her breasts developing appropriately. At 14, her modesty was extinguished in the name of statecraft. When the time came, the boy they called her husband stood stiff as carved stone. Charles Roman XIII kissed her cheek with lips dry as parchment, then shrank to the far side of the bed. Hours later, stained sheets were paraded before the court as proof of consummation, though whispers said the blood came from a slaughtered chicken. The official record proclaimed her queen and wife. The truth was that she was little more than a frightened child beside another frightened child, bound together in a ritual neither understood. From that night forward, humiliation became daily bread. The French courtiers appraised Anna as though she were a curiosity shipped from Spain, their eyes lingering on her darker complexion, her Spanish accent mocked in drawing rooms. "Too small, too foreign," they murmured. "Spanish blood runs thick. No wonder she fails to charm." Even beauty was turned to torment. French fashion demanded lead-based powders that leached into her skin, cracking it into sores hidden beneath rouge. Corsets laced until her ribs ached made every breath an effort. The castles themselves were prisons of filth, cold corridors where vermin thrived, chambers where lice nested in feather beds. Beneath the gilded ceilings and painted saints, stench and sickness lingered like shadows. Motherhood, the sole duty expected of her, quickly became her crucifixion. Within 2 years she conceived, only to deliver a stillborn child. The court's joy curdled into murmurs. Had she angered God, eaten the wrong foods, entertained dark thoughts? Physicians pressed ground pearls and bull's blood to her lips, promising fertility, promising life. Each remedy sickened her further. When another pregnancy ended in blood and silence, Charles Roman XIII contempt erupted. He thundered that she was not truly wife but purchased stock, unworthy of the throne. Her loneliness deepened when her Spanish attendants, the last voices that sang lullabies from her childhood, were dismissed by royal order. In their place came women loyal not to her, but to Cardinal Duval, the king's shadow. They rifled through her letters, reported her sighs and tears, even betrayed her confessions whispered to priests. No secret, no sorrow, no prayer was safe. Anna learned to wear silence as armor, to trust no one. Every failed pregnancy carried a public execution of her reputation. Rumors spread like wildfire that she was cursed, barren, bewitched, that her womb was as cold as Spanish marble. Some whispered she dabbled in sorcery to spite France. When she walked the corridors, courtiers' eyes slid away as though childlessness were contagious. Charles Roman XIII, meanwhile, withdrew to the company of falconers and favorites, returning to her chamber only when duty pressed, each encounter mechanical, loveless, and brief. The contrast between appearances and reality was cruel. At banquets, Anna appeared draped in velvet and jewels, seated beneath golden chandeliers while music echoed across mirrored halls. Toasts were raised to her grace, her fertility, her role as mother of future kings. Yet behind the scenes, she lay in bed weeping into her pillows, her body racked with bleeding after yet another lost child. She learned to smile for the crowd even as her ribs ached beneath the corset and her skin burned from lead paint. Still, amidst the cold machinery of court, flickers of humanity survived. A maid, risking punishment, hummed the old Spanish lullabies that reminded Anna of orange groves and sunlit courtyards. For a moment, she was a girl again, not a queen drowning in expectation. Another time, she found kinship with a young lady in waiting who whispered kindness, shared secrets, even dared to laugh with her. But kindness was dangerous currency. Weeks later, that woman was accused of treason, banished overnight. Anna never saw her again. The message was clear: affection was a liability. Years stretched on in this rhythm of hope and despair, conceiving, bleeding, grieving. The palace corridors grew colder, the courtiers' whispers sharper, her husband's gaze more distant. Each miscarriage left her weaker, but also harder, her heart calcifying against pain. The child bride who once prayed for kindness began to pray only for endurance. She was still alive, but in every way that mattered, Anna of Austria had been entombed in France the moment those wedding bells rang. The second stillbirth shattered what little strength Anna had left. She had carried the child for months, obeying every command of her physicians, lying still, drinking their bitter concoctions, whispering prayers until her lips cracked. Yet the end was the same, blood pooling on the marble floor, midwives shaking their heads, the silence of a child who never drew breath. Charles Roman XIII stormed into her chamber as she still bled, his face contorted with rage. "A Habsburg curse," he spat, slamming his fist into the wall until his knuckles split and bled. "Purchased, not married, useless!" His words cut deeper than the pain in her body. He did not weep for the child. He did not take her hand. He left her with contempt as her only comfort. Then came the scandal. Cardinal Duval, ever watchful, produced letters Anna had written to her brother in Spain, fragments of longing, laments of loneliness, written in the only language she still trusted. To Duval, they became evidence of treason. He presented them to the council, declaring her a spy, a conspirator against France. Whispers of annulment spread. Some even demanded she be imprisoned, stripped of crown and title. Anna laughed bitterly when the accusations were read aloud. "If I sought escape," she told her accusers, "why would I marry another French prince? I would have fled to Madrid." But her words fell into the cold silence of men who had already judged her guilty. She stood at the brink of ruin, her body exhausted, her reputation destroyed, her marriage little more than a prison. And then fate intervened, cruel in its irony. A winter storm descended upon Paris with such fury that the king's travel was halted. Roads vanished beneath snow, bridges cracked beneath ice. For the first time in years, Charles Roman XIII was forced to remain in the Louvre, and protocol demanded he share his wife's bed. The chamber was lit with firelight, the windows sealed against howling winds. He looked at her not with tenderness, but with resignation, a man cornered by duty. What passed between them was neither passion nor love, but a desperate fulfillment of obligation. Yet in that reluctant intimacy, something impossible took root. Months later, Anna felt the first stirring of life within her belly. Fear clenched her heart at every quickening, every whisper of pain, but this time, against all odds, the child lived. On a September morning, as bells rang across Paris, she gave birth to a son, Charles, heir to France. The boy cried, and the kingdom erupted in joy. Bonfires lit the hills, churches sang Te Deums, courtiers declared it a miracle. For the first time, Anna held a living child in her arms. The court called her blessed. The king called her duty fulfilled. But only Anna knew the truth. Her torment had been transformed into triumph, not by love, not by choice, but by the caprice of fate and a storm that refused to let a king leave his wife's bed. The birth of Charles secured Anna's place in the French court, but providence, or irony, was not yet finished with her. 15 months later, lightning struck twice, she bore a second son, Philippe, delicate but healthy. In the eyes of France, she had at last justified her crown. The courtiers who once whispered of curses now sang her praises, hailing her womb as miraculous. But Anna knew the truth. The same body that had betrayed her 4 times before had now, by chance or divine cruelty, delivered the dynasty its salvation. When Charles Roman XIII succumbed to illness years later, his final will sought to chain her still, binding France to a regency council meant to curb her influence. Yet Anna, tempered by decades of humiliation, proved steel hidden beneath silk. Appearing before Parliament draped in mourning black, she convinced the men who once sneered at her to break the dead king's will. With calm authority, she reminded them that she had given France not 1 but 2 heirs, and that no council of courtiers could love or protect them as she would. Against expectation, she emerged sole regent of France. In those years, she outmaneuvered rivals, steered treaties, and held a fractured kingdom together through civil unrest. She became the guardian of her son, Charles Roman XIV. The boy history would later name the Sun King. France flourished under her steady hand, but what triumph cost her cannot be measured in titles. She had surrendered her childhood to politics, her body to endless pregnancies, her spirit to suspicion. She lost 4 infants, endured decades as a stranger in a hostile court, and silenced her Spanish tongue until it tasted foreign even to her own mouth. History remembers her as the mother of the Sun King, the regent who preserved a monarchy. Rarely does it remember the girl who was stripped at 14 before strangers, inspected like cattle, forced to abandon her homeland, and taught that her worth began and ended in the cradle. She gave France its future, but the price was her own happiness, her own identity. Anna of Austria survived, but the child who once answered to that name had long ago been erased.